he saw that I had some talent, number one,
Yeah.
God-given talent, and then he saw I had drive.
Harvey Mason has been the heartbeat of jazz and fusion. Drummer, composer, and producer, shaping the soundtracks of generations. With sticks in hand, he built bridges between worlds, his playing as precise as it was soulful. But offstage, behind the applause and accolades, there was another story. One tied to Bob James, his longtime partner in music, but also the source of secrets no one dared to ask about. At 78, Harvey Mason finally speaks. And what he admits about Bob James doesn't just add to the foreplay legend, it reframes it completely. But what truth did Mason finally reveal that has fans questioning everything? Stay with us as we find out. Every great band has its axis, its unshakable core, the force around which everything else revolves. For foreplay, that axis was Bob James and Harvey Mason. From the outside, it looked like a perfect balance. James, the virtuoso pianist whose compositions came to define the sound of smooth jazz, and Mason, the powerhouse drummer whose grooves could lift any arrangement from ordinary to transcendent. Together, they built not just a band, but a legacy that stretched across decades. To fans, their partnership seemed effortless, inevitable, almost destined. But behind the harmony, behind the smiles on stage and the polished records, there was a storm that Mason, at 78 years old, finally chose to reveal. Bob James had always been a perfectionist. In fact, his reputation depended on it. Critics praised him as a musical architect, a man who approached each composition as if it were a cathedral being built from sound. Every chord had a place. Every silence was intentional. Every note was scrutinized until it served his vision perfectly. To many musicians, this precision was inspiring, the mark of a genius unwilling to compromise. But for Harvey Mason, it was something else entirely. For a drummer, music isn't only about discipline, it's about instinct, about responding in real time to the heartbeat of a performance. Mason thrived on spontaneity, on letting a rhythm breathe. Yet James's demand for control often turned that freedom into rigidity. What audiences heard as seamless chemistry, Mason frequently experienced as suffocation. Rehearsals that looked polished from the outside were often grueling battles of will. James insisted on multiple takes, on endless repetition until the exact sound in his head was captured. Mason, whose instincts told him the first or second take often carried the real magic, felt his creativity clipped at the wings. The public saw elegance and unity. Mason saw control. And yet, the results couldn't be denied. Together, James and Mason created music that soared. Foreplay's albums didn't just sell, they defined a genre. Their sound became synonymous with smooth jazz, polished, seductive, endlessly listenable. Fans filled concert halls, mesmerized by the sight of James at the piano, commanding the keys with icy elegance, while Mason sat behind the drum kit, driving the rhythm with a force that felt unstoppable. To the world, it was two masters in perfect sync, feeding off each other's brilliance. But to Mason, every performance carried the weight of compromise. The truth was that their partnership was never effortless. It was a constant negotiation. Every session, every rehearsal, was a tug-of-war between James's obsession with control and Mason's hunger for freedom. And while their music bore the marks of both men, the discipline of James, the instinct of Mason, the process was draining. Over time, the cracks deepened, though the world was never allowed to see them. Mason smiled for cameras, posed for photographs, and gave interviews that painted foreplay as a brotherhood of equals. But privately, he swallowed his resentment. He carried that silence for decades. And perhaps, in part, he carried it out of loyalty. Foreplay's success depended on the illusion of unity. To break that illusion might have endangered everything they had built. But silence takes its toll. Mason lived with the tension, lived with the knowledge that behind every standing ovation was a story no one dared to tell. Now, at 78, Mason finally admits what no one wanted to believe. The partnership that built Foreplay, the collaboration that millions thought was unbreakable, was never as perfect as it appeared. It was built not only on talent and shared vision, but also on compromise, conflict, and a silent battle for respect. And with that admission, Mason forces fans to look again, not just at the music they loved, but at the men who made it, and the fragile truths that held it all together. In the early days, their collaboration felt like destiny. Bob James and Harvey Mason were two masters in their prime, orbiting each other's brilliance in a way that seemed almost supernatural. When they entered the studio together, something electric happened. James's intricate harmonies and meticulous arrangements created a rich canvas, and Mason, with his explosive yet controlled drumming, painted it with color, texture, and pulse. Each take felt less like work and more like discovery. James pushed Mason to new levels of precision, while Mason's groove pulled James into daring, rhythmic territory. Together, they were unstoppable, two titans who seemed to bring out the very best in each other. But somewhere along the way, that natural chemistry curdled. What began as conversations between equals slowly morphed into confrontations. The sessions that once buzzed with excitement began to feel like battlefields. James's perfectionism, once inspiring, sharpened into something harsher, something more punishing. His standards grew so exacting that they left no room for spontaneity. He would demand endless retakes, dissecting not just Mason's tempo, but his tone, his fills, even the subtle spaces between beats. For Mason, a drummer whose artistry lived in those spaces, it was suffocating. The freedom that once defined their partnership began to vanish under James's tightening grip. The breaking point came during the recording of what would later be hailed as one of Foreplay's most celebrated albums. Mason had just laid down a drum track that, by all accounts, was inspired. Other band members praised it as powerful, dynamic, alive. One of those rare performances where instinct and technique collided in perfect balance. But James didn't see it that way. He waved it off as imperfect. He wanted cleaner lines, tighter rhythms, less personality. "Do it again," he said, again and again. Each retake drained the spark from Mason's playing, replacing fire with frustration. After hours of repetition, Mason finally snapped. He slammed his sticks against the kit, the crack echoing through the studio like a gunshot. Then he stood, muttering under his breath that James didn't want a drummer at all. He wanted a machine. And with that, he stormed out, leaving stunned silence in his wake. The others sat frozen, caught between loyalty to James's vision and sympathy for Mason's breaking point. Publicly, the incident was smoothed over. Producers spun it as nothing more than creative differences, the kind of minor clash that happens in any great band. The album went on to sell, the tour went on to succeed, and fans remained blissfully unaware. But behind closed doors, the damage was done. Something fundamental had shifted. For Mason, the bond that once felt like destiny now felt like a burden. He no longer saw James as a collaborator, but as an adversary, someone determined to strip the soul from his playing in the name of control. From that moment forward, the partnership was never the same. Every session became a test of wills, every rehearsal a negotiation between pride and patience. Mason approached the studio not with anticipation, but with dread, bracing for the inevitable clash. James, for his part, doubled down on his authority, convinced that only his standards could preserve Foreplay's reputation for excellence. To the outside world, none of this was visible. On stage, they projected unity. James at the piano, his touch refined and elegant, Mason behind the drums, steady and commanding. The music never faltered. Fans heard perfection, synergy, balance. But beneath the polished surface lay a fragile truce, a partnership held together less by friendship than by necessity. Collaboration was no longer the goal. It had become competition, an unspoken contest of wills between two giants, too proud to yield and too talented to walk away. The music endured, but their friendship quietly withered, leaving only the facade of harmony. Foreplay's rise was nothing short of meteoric. From the moment their debut album hit the shelves in 1991, it was clear they weren't just another jazz quartet. They were a phenomenon. The record sold millions, climbing charts in ways no one thought contemporary jazz ever could. Their sound was everywhere, spinning on late-night radio, drifting through hotel lobbies, soundtracking dinner parties, and filling concert halls with audiences that stretched far beyond the traditional jazz crowd. For the outside world, they seemed untouchable. Four virtuosos blending seamlessly into one perfect sound. The embodiment of harmony. The very picture of balance. But the reality behind that polished exterior was far messier. Beneath the shimmering notes and elegant arrangements, the battles between Bob James and Harvey Mason never stopped. They weren't loud public explosions. They weren't headline-grabbing scandals. They were silent, insidious wars fought in rehearsal rooms, in studios, and on stages across the globe. For years, the public saw unity, but for those inside the band, the truth was impossible to ignore. Rehearsals became the front lines. Bob James, armed with his meticulously drawn charts, conducted the room like a general. Every bar was accounted for, every note calculated, every transition carefully placed. To James, music was architecture, and he was the architect. Mason, by contrast, lived in rhythm. He thrived on instinct, on letting the groove evolve naturally, on breathing life into structure. That difference, once the source of their brilliance, hardened into conflict. It was like watching two kings fight for the same throne. One insider recalled, "They needed each other, but they could barely stand each other." Even Lee Ritenour and Nathan East, both consummate professionals, often found themselves trapped in the middle. They tried to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to remind James and Mason that the band was bigger than their feud. But mediation only went so far. More often than not, they simply watched the sparks fly, hoping the fire wouldn't consume them all. The tension didn't vanish when the lights came on. On tour, the conflict slipped into their performances, hidden in plain sight. James would stretch a piano solo past its natural breaking point, elongating it until Mason was forced to adjust on the spot. Mason would push the tempo, daring James to keep up, nudging the groove just enough to disrupt the pianist's carefully laid plans. To the audience, it looked like thrilling improvisation, the kind of playful one-upmanship that jazz is famous for. But to the band, it was warfare disguised as music. Still, neither man ever admitted defeat. Their pride was too great, their reputations too large, their legacies too carefully built to risk. And so, they kept the illusion alive. Photographers captured them shaking hands, magazines printed glossy spreads of them laughing together, interviews overflowed with polite compliments and stories of brotherhood. The public saw harmony. What they didn't see was the resentment building quietly behind those smiles. That silence became their contract. The music came first. The truth stayed buried. For Mason, that meant swallowing his anger, suppressing his need for acknowledgement, and settling into the role James allowed him. He was more than a drummer, but the world rarely saw it. His identity became confined, his voice muted by the band's spotless image. And he accepted it, or at least convinced himself he did. But silence is heavy. Carry it long enough, and it begins to shape you. For decades, Mason bore the weight of that unspoken truce, all while convincing himself the music was worth the cost. It wasn't until later, when age softened his defenses, that he realized what the silence had stolen. Not just his patience, not just his pride, but his voice. And so, when he finally spoke at 78, the revelation landed like a thunderclap. The very success of Foreplay, its flawless, shimmering sound, had not been built on harmony at all. It had been built on battles, sharpened into silence, and buried so deeply that fans never heard them. Until Mason decided they would. Perfection has a cost, and in Foreplay, that cost was extracted from Harvey Mason day after day. Bob James demanded nothing less than flawlessness, not just from himself, but from everyone around him. His ear was legendary, capable of catching the slightest slip, the faintest deviation from his vision. For many, it was awe-inspiring. For Mason, it was exhausting. Every recording session became a marathon of patience. Mason would lay down drum tracks that most musicians would consider untouchable, only for James to shake his head and call for another take. Cleaner, he would say, tighter, less flourish. To Mason, it felt as if James wasn't hearing the groove, the life in the rhythm, but only the cold precision of the metronome. What Mason brought as heart, James treated as imperfection. Over time, that dynamic eroded Mason's enthusiasm. Where once he entered the studio eager to create, he began arriving with a quiet dread, knowing his instincts would be questioned, his artistry second-guessed. The joy of drumming, the very thing that had made him a legend, was dulled by the constant scrutiny. Yet Mason never walked away. Part of it was pride. He was too stubborn to let James win, too determined to prove his worth. But another part was loyalty. To the band, to the fans, to the music they created together. He knew Foreplay was bigger than their feud, and so he endured the grind, sacrificing his own satisfaction for the greater whole. That sacrifice, however, left scars. By the time Mason reached his 70s, the memories of applause and accolades were inseparable from the bitterness of those sessions. At 78, when he finally broke his silence, it was not to diminish Bob James's genius, but to reveal the hidden price of perfection. The music may have been timeless, but behind it was a man who carried the weight of being told over and over that his best was never enough. The public loved the idea of Bob James and Harvey Mason as close collaborators, bonded by decades of music-making. Interviews painted them as brothers in arms, men who respected each other too much to let ego get in the way. But the truth, as Mason later admitted, was far more complicated. Were they friends, or were they rivals? Even Mason wasn't sure. Offstage, their relationship was a strange mix of camaraderie and distance. There were moments of genuine warmth, dinners after shows, late-night talks about the future of jazz, even shared laughter at the absurdities of fame. But those moments were fleeting, always overshadowed by the underlying tension. James's need for control didn't end in the studio. It seeped into their personal dynamic, making it hard for Mason to ever feel fully at ease. Colleagues noticed the divide. While James would often be surrounded by producers and executives, Mason kept to himself, finding solace with fellow drummers and session players who understood his frustrations. They weren't enemies, one insider explained, but they weren't friends either. They were two titans circling each other, always wary, never fully trusting. That wariness colored everything. Even when they stood side by side on stage, smiles plastered for the audience, there was a distance in their eyes, a subtle acknowledgement that beneath the performance was a rivalry neither could escape. Mason, in particular, struggled with the paradox. He owed much of his fame to foreplay and James's leadership, yet he resented how small James sometimes made him feel. When Mason finally opened up, he confessed that he had long wrestled with this contradiction. He admired James's brilliance, but bristled at his dominance. He respected him as a partner, but distrusted him as a man. And perhaps most painfully, he realized that the friendship fans believed in had never truly existed. What they had was something else entirely, a rivalry disguised as harmony. Every long partnership eventually faces a breaking point, the moment when silence shatters, when one side finally says, "Enough." For Harvey Mason and Bob James, that breaking point seemed inevitable. The arguments in the studio, the cold stares backstage, the unspoken tension during interviews, it was all building toward an explosion. And yet, it never came. Why? Mason himself struggled to answer that question. In hindsight, he admitted that part of him was simply afraid. Walking away from foreplay would have meant walking away from a career-defining legacy. And for all his frustrations with James, Mason knew the band was bigger than either of them. To leave would have been to abandon not just James, but Rittenauer, East, and the millions of fans who saw foreplay as untouchable. Another reason was pride. Mason didn't want James to think he had won by driving him out. The drummer had built his reputation on resilience, on the ability to adapt and thrive in any setting. Quitting would have been a concession he wasn't willing to make. So instead of breaking, Mason bent, swallowing his pride, tamping down his anger, and carrying on. But silence can be its own kind of breaking. By never confronting James directly, Mason let the resentment calcify, turning into something heavier and harder to release. Decades passed, albums were made, tours came and went, and still the silence endured. To the public, their partnership looked unshakable. Privately, it was two men locked in a stalemate, each unwilling to give in, each unwilling to walk away. When Mason finally spoke at 78, it wasn't to reveal some dramatic explosion or final confrontation. The breaking point had never come. Instead, he confessed that the real tragedy was in what never happened: the honest conversation, the reckoning, the release. Their silence, once a strategy for survival, had become their greatest burden. And in that silence, both men lost something they could never recover: the chance to truly understand each other. In the glittering world of smooth jazz, reputations are often as carefully curated as the music itself. Foreplay was sold as unity, four virtuosos creating harmony together, each contributing equally to the magic. But behind closed doors, whispers painted a different picture. The rumor was always the same: Bob James held the reins too tightly, and Harvey Mason was the one paying the price. Producers who had worked with the band told stories of Mason's parts being picked apart, until only James's vision remained. Engineers recalled sessions where Mason's natural swing was ironed flat by James's insistence on mathematical precision. The music was undeniably brilliant, but some wondered whether it was truly collaboration, or dictatorship disguised as democracy. Industry insiders weren't blind to the strain. They noticed Mason's patience thinning, his smiles forced, his silence telling. But in a business built on appearances, few dared to speak openly. To question Bob James was to question the foundation of foreplay, and that was a risk no one wanted to take. So the whispers remained whispers, traded in hushed tones at after-parties, backstage gatherings, and industry dinners. For Mason, those whispers were salt in the wound. He didn't want pity, he wanted acknowledgement. But as long as the public believed the fantasy, he had no choice but to carry the burden quietly. Every review praising Foreplay's flawless chemistry felt like a reminder of the truth he couldn't share. When Mason broke his silence decades later, he confirmed what many had suspected but never dared to say aloud: that Foreplay's perfection came at a cost, and that cost was often his own freedom. By exposing what the whispers had only hinted at, he transformed rumor into revelation, and forever altered the way fans would hear the music. The question haunted everyone once Harvey Mason finally spoke. Why did he wait until 78? Why endure decades of tension? Why shoulder the silence when he could have spoken out earlier? The answer, as Mason revealed, was a mixture of loyalty, fear, and pragmatism. First, there was loyalty. Foreplay was more than a band. It was a phenomenon, a brand, a symbol of sophistication in jazz. To expose the cracks would have been to endanger everything they had built together. Mason loved the music, loved the fans, and in his own way, loved the idea of Foreplay. Protecting that dream meant sacrificing his own truth. Then there was fear, not of James himself, but of the fallout. Mason knew the industry's politics. Speaking out against a figure as powerful as Bob James could have branded him as difficult, threatening his opportunities and reputation. Better to stay silent and keep working than to risk exile from the very world he had helped shape. Pragmatism also played its part. Mason was a professional, a man who valued stability. Foreplay provided steady work, international tours, and financial security. To jeopardize that would have been reckless, especially when he had a family to provide for. Silence, however bitter, was safer than upheaval. But silence has a way of aging poorly. As the years passed, Mason began to feel the weight of what he had never said. The unspoken truths became ghosts, haunting him in quiet moments, pressing on him during interviews, lingering in every polite nod toward James's genius. At 78, with little left to lose, Mason finally chose freedom over silence. His confession wasn't about revenge, it was about release. After a lifetime of playing the perfect role, he wanted to step into the truth, to tell the world what really happened, not out of bitterness, but out of a need to finally breathe without the weight of secrecy. When Harvey Mason finally spoke, the room fell silent. There was no script, no polished press release, just a man in his late 70s, weary but unflinching, ready to share what he had buried for decades. The words weren't angry, they were matter of fact, almost clinical. But beneath them was the force of a lifetime spent holding back. He admitted what many had suspected. Bob James's dominance had suffocated him. The endless corrections, the perfectionism, the dismissal of his instincts, they had all chipped away at his joy. Mason described how James would demand retakes until the groove was lifeless, how he would override suggestions, how every decision seemed to orbit James's will. It wasn't a partnership, Mason said. It was Bob's world. We just lived in it. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. Fans who had idolized the band's chemistry felt betrayed. Industry insiders nodded knowingly, relieved that the truth had finally surfaced. And Mason himself looked lighter, as if speaking had lifted a burden he had carried far too long. But his confession wasn't purely bitter. Mason also acknowledged James's brilliance, his unmatched vision, his ability to create music that stood the test of time. He didn't deny the beauty they had made together, he simply revealed the cost. It was a nuanced truth, one that refused to flatten James into villain or Mason into victim. Still, the weight of the admission was undeniable. For the first time, the myth of foreplay cracked wide open. Behind the smooth polish of the music was a story of control, silence, and endurance. And at 78, Harvey Mason finally let the world see it. In the aftermath of Harvey Mason's confession, foreplay could never be heard the same way again. The shimmering harmonies, the flawless interplay, the effortless grooves, all of it now carried the shadow of what Mason revealed. What once sounded like unity now echoed with tension. What once felt like effortless chemistry now rang with the effort of silence. The revelation didn't erase the music's brilliance, but it reframed it. Fans began revisiting old albums with new ears, listening for the friction beneath the polish. Every drum beat became a question. Was this Mason's true voice, or the version Bob James allowed to survive? The band's legacy, once untouchable, was now marked by complexity, brilliance born from struggle, beauty forged in conflict. For Mason, the confession was both an ending and a liberation. After decades of swallowing his truth, he had finally spoken it aloud. There was no taking it back, no smoothing it over. But at 78, he no longer cared about appearances or industry politics. The truth, raw and unvarnished, was its own reward. And for Bob James? Silence. Perhaps he chose not to dignify the revelation with a response. Perhaps he saw no need to defend himself. Or perhaps, in that silence, there was an acknowledgement that Mason's words, after all these years, could not be denied. In the end, Harvey Mason's confession didn't destroy foreplay. It humanized it. It reminded the world that even legends are flawed, that even music born of genius can carry hidden scars. And it ensured that the story of foreplay would never again be told as one of perfect harmony, but as something far more real. A testament to the beauty and the cost of collaboration. If collaboration hides more than music, should we leave it there? Or wonder what silence was meant to protect? At 78, Harvey Mason finally opens up about Bob James, but the truth of his words depends on how we listen. Before time softens the beat of history, remember, some confessions are meant to echo forever. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.